Evio.
Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Blood on the Bluegrass. This is Chapter 1, The Vampire of Murray County. There are parts of America where the night feels older than the daylight it replaces, where the dark doesn't simply fall, it settles. In western Kentucky, that darkness rolls over the fields like something with memory. And Murray, Kentucky is one of those towns. A quiet, respectable, university-anchored community where the loudest thing on a Friday night is the buzzing glow of the Walmart sign and the occasional teenage insistence that nothing ever happens here. Kids in Murray grow up dreaming of anywhere else, and adults pretend that they don't hear the restlessness. It's a place that prizes normalcy, but you don't have to scratch very deep to find a different story. Sometimes normalcy is just a paint job that you slap on a house that actually has cracks running straight through the foundation. In the mid-1990s, one of those cracks widened into a chasm, and out of it stepped a boy who insisted that he wasn't a boy at all. His name was Rod Ferrell, though he preferred something more theatrical. Visago, a centuries-old vampire from a lineage he described with the casual authority of someone reciting their grandmother's cookie recipes. Now look, he wasn't the first teenager to try on a darker identity, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But something about him cut deeper. Even in a landscape full of adolescent bravado and role-playing masquerade games, Rod carried himself with a seriousness that made his fantasies feel less like inventions and more like declarations. Rod didn't belong anywhere, and he knew it, and that's what made him dangerous. He was the kind of teenager who clung to outsider status the way that some cling to family heirlooms, tightly, defensively, insisting that it meant something. His real home life was unstable, troubled in the quiet, suffocating way that rarely leads to intervention, but almost always leaves a mark. His mother, Sandra, floated in and out of occult interests that were more decorative than devout, but they provided an atmosphere. Candles, symbols, a suggestion that the world was larger and stranger than adults like to admit. And Rod absorbed it like a sponge. He let it expand inside him until it became an identity that he could inhabit fully. And for kids that are desperate for escape, identity is currency. Now, Murray, Kentucky didn't have anything resembling a vampire subculture. There were no clubs, no scene, no thriving goth community. But isolated kids don't need a community. They just need one person to tell them that their loneliness is special. And Rod became that person. He was magnetic in the way that teenagers with absolute confidence always are. He spoke softly, but dramatically, like someone that was narrating his own movie. He wore long coats that dragged behind him like a shadow. He adopted mannerisms that suggested he knew secrets that he didn't. And for the right kind of lost kid, that was all it took. Role-playing games, especially one called Vampire the Masquerade, gave the group language for who they wanted to be. But Rod wasn't content simply with metaphor. When he said he was immortal, he meant it. Or at least he wanted others to believe that he meant it. So the game became the manual, the myth became scripture, and Rod became the self-appointed priest. Around him gathered a handful of teenagers too young to understand the power that they felt was borrowed. It was conditional, dependent entirely on Rod's approval. For them, this wasn't merely dress-up. It was belonging. It was purpose. It was family, in the kind of twisted shape that forms when the real version is missing or broken. Rod told them he could turn them, like turn them into a vampire, just as he had been turned. He described rituals that sounded mystical enough to feel important, but vague enough to still be improvised. He talked about ancient pacts and bloodlines and darkness running through their veins. If someone, pushed a little too hard for details, Rod became defensive. A sign, in hindsight, that even he knew how fragile the illusion was. But most didn't push. They were teenagers. They didn't want truth. They wanted a life that felt bigger than their own. And the adults of Murray, Kentucky, predictably, didn't notice. Or if they noticed, they dismissed it as, harmless rebellion. Trench coats, eyeliner, a little melodramatic poetry, nothing new. No one saw the escalation, the way the fantasy began tightening like a vice. Rod needed followers to maintain the myth, and the myth needed escalation to stay alive. He began talking about destiny, about liberation, about breaking free from the smallness of their lives. The fantasy grew teeth. His most devoted follower was Charity Kesey. She saw Rod not as a boy lost between worlds, but as a prophet guiding her into one. Dana Cooper joined too. She was more malleable, but equally drawn in. And then there was Scott Anderson, eager for camaraderie, eager for role-playing to feel real. Now, these weren't evil kids. They were unmoored, lonely, craving significance. And Rod gave them a narrative that made them feel chosen. And then there was Heather Wendorf, the most complicated figure in this constellation. She wasn't part of the Kentucky core group, but when Rod met her on a trip to Florida, he became obsessed. Heather was bright, artistic, slightly detached from her surroundings, and she spoke casually of feeling misunderstood at home. In Rod, she recognized someone who listened. In Heather, Rod recognized someone who validated his self-image. Whether she ever fully believed in the vampire mythology is a different question, one that will haunt every chapter of this story. But what matters now is simple. Heather became the emotional North Star of Rod's dark universe. By early 1996, the group no longer felt like a social circle. It felt like a clan, a unit with its own rituals, its own hierarchy, its own gravitational pull. Rod walked around Murray as if surveying the edges of a territory that only he could see. He talked about leaving the town behind, about creating something new, something free of rules. He described himself as immortal, but what he craved most was the immortality of impact. He wanted to matter. He wanted a story. The people around him couldn't yet see how far he was willing to go to create one. The local gossip, because small towns generate gossip like heat, eventually caught wind of that vampire kid. Parents rolled their eyes, teachers shrugged, police officers considered it just a harmless hobby. And in most cases, they would have been absolutely right. Because we all know teenagers try on dark fantasies all the time. But Rod wasn't trying on anything. He was constructing a world brick by brick, belief by belief, and demanding others live inside it with him. The chapter of the story that follows, the road trip, the escalation, the murders, will be dissected endlessly by psychologists, by criminologists, and sensational media outlets. But none of that makes sense until you understand this. Before Rod Ferrell committed an act of brutality, he committed an act of self-invention. He created a character powerful enough to silence the frightened kid that lived just beneath it. And once the performance became the only version of himself that he could tolerate, he had no intention of letting it go. He was 17. 17 and already convinced that he had outgrown mortality, morality, and the small, trembling fears that keep the rest of us tethered to reality. In Murray, Kentucky, the darkness had found its narrator, and the story he was writing was about to spill well beyond the page. Chapter 2, The Lost and the Searching. If Chapter 1 was about the myth Rod Ferrell built around himself, Chapter 2 is about the people who stepped willingly into it. Because no cult, especially one born in the bedrooms and parking lots of American suburbia, no cult begins with murder. It begins with teenagers who feel like shadows in their own homes. Kids whose interior lives are noisier than anyone around them realizes. Kids who are waiting, often desperately, for someone to tell them that they're seen. Rod understood that loneliness instinctively. He could sense it in others like a tuning fork, vibrating in sympathetic frequency. And the ones who gathered around him weren't random. They were kids standing at the edge of their own internal cliffs, and Rod, for a time, seemed like someone who knew how to fly. Charity Kesey was one of the first. Charity grew up in a world that expected girls to be agreeable, predictable, and tidy. But beneath the surface was a longing, not for danger necessarily, but for intensity. She wanted something that felt bigger than the shrink-wrapped version of adolescence that she'd been sold. When Rod talked about immortality and ancient bloodlines, Charity didn't hear delusion. She heard possibility. She heard a door opening. She heard someone giving language to the parts of herself that she had never dared name aloud. And make no mistake, Rod wasn't stupid. He recognized in Charity a natural disciple, someone who needed structure, belonging, and a narrator. And he became all three. Dana Cooper came next, orbiting more quietly than Charity. Dana didn't have the same theatrical hunger. She had the kind of presence that made adults describe her as a good kid, a phrase that often signals someone who's learned to swallow their own turmoil. Dana wasn't drawn to the mythology as much as she was drawn to the companionship. For teenagers who feel invisible, even friendship built on fantasy can feel like salvation. Dana wanted connection. Rod wanted obedience. The arrangement worked. Then there was Scott Anderson, sweet, impressionable, always wanting to be liked. Scott wasn't a believer so much as a joiner. He wanted to belong someplace, to something, to anything that told him he wasn't just another face in the high school yearbook. He liked the pageantry. He liked the camaraderie. He also liked that around Rod, he didn't have to pretend that he enjoyed football games and bonfire beer parties. He could be part of a tribe, even if the tribe was stitched together from that black eyeliner and chain wallets and borrowed mythology. These kids weren't hardened criminals. They weren't, future killers. They were the kind of adolescents who fell through the social cracks. We all know them. Every town has them. The kind every generation forgets to notice until it's too late. And then, like a gravitational shift pulling the group southward, there was Heather Wendorf. It's impossible to tell this story without acknowledging the ambiguity surrounding Heather. In the years since, every documentary, every article, every podcast like this one has tried to decode her level of involvement. Did she genuinely believe Rod was coming to rescue her? Did she actually feel unsafe in her home with her parents and her sister? Or was she simply a 15-year-old girl intoxicated by the idea of being chosen by an older boy who wrapped his attention in mysticism and power? What we can say is this: Heather described her home life as oppressive. Whether that description was accurate, maybe exaggerated, or simply interpreted through the dramatic lens of adolescence is impossible to quantify. But Rod seized on it. Heather became the centerpiece of this story, the princess trapped in a tower, the soul that he was destined to liberate. And whether she intended to or not, Heather gave Rod something he'd been lacking: a quest. So it's remarkable how quickly the group shifted once Heather entered the picture. Before her, Rod's mythology was primarily internal, something that he performed among friends. But after Heather, it became directional. Suddenly there was an enemy, a villainous household keeping her caged. Suddenly Rod wasn't just playing vampire. He was protector, savior, romantic avenger. And this is where the psychology of the group begins to bend. Because when the story becomes about salvation, the moral boundaries don't just blur. They completely rearrange. The clan began framing themselves as heroes in a narrative that no one could see but them. Heather's parents, Richard and Naoma Wendorf, they became the faceless villains. And villains, in Rod's mind, were disposable. But long before the violence, the clan existed in a strange liminal space. It was half theater, half therapy session. They met in basements and wooded areas and parking lots after dark, acting out rituals that Rod designed to feel ancient and esoteric. Now, these weren't historically accurate occult practices at all. They were imagination, layered over teen insecurity. Rod spoke of turning his followers into vampires, but the ritual amounted to little more than superficial ceremony and the occasional exchange of blood from minor cuts on the hand. It was theater. But theater can be powerful when the audience is fragile. The clan members believed, at least for a time, that they were becoming something larger than themselves. They believed they were stepping into an identity that transcended the banal chaos of adolescence. Rod dangled that transcendence like a carrot, and the kids followed willingly. Again, the adults in their lives dismissed it as harmless rebellion, a phrase wrapped in dark clothing. The schools were accustomed to kids expressing themselves in ways that shocked exactly no one. All right, this was the 1990s. Everyone's kid was experimenting with something. But what made Rod's group different wasn't the aesthetic. It was the horrific escalation. Rod began insisting that the outside world was corrupt, that only the clan understood true existence. He told them that mortality was a lie, that rules were chains designed to keep them enslaved to mediocrity. And when you combine teenage insecurity with a mythology that promises power, you create a very combustible mixture. Rod wasn't just playing a role. He was building a framework that justified anything, absolutely anything, done in service of the clan. What's so chilling is how organic it all seemed at the time. No one sat down and announced, "Hey, we're forming a cult over here." It just happened, slowly and quietly, the way mold spreads across a wall. At first, it's just a small smudge. Then it's a pattern. And eventually, it's the only thing you can see. The group found meaning in Rod's structure. They found intimacy in the shared secrecy. They found identity in the mythology. And Rod found something too. Authority. It changed the way he walked, the way he spoke, the way that he looked at the world. He became someone who believed his own performance. And when someone believes that they're chosen and convinces others to believe it too, the next step is inevitable. The clan was no longer content to exist in the shadows of Murray, Kentucky. They needed to move. They needed purpose, a journey. And Rod, intoxicated by Heather's distress, crafted the next chapter with the precision of a novelist building toward a climax. The stage was set, the players were assembled, and the line between fantasy and reality was already beginning to tear. Chapter 3, Crossing the Threshold. There's a moment in every story when the ground begins to shift beneath the character's feet. And no one, least of all the characters, realizes what's happening. It's never dramatic at first. It's subtle. It's barely perceptible, like a draft coming through a window you didn't know was open. For Rod Ferrell and the so-called vampire clan, that shift began with a single decision. They were leaving Kentucky. The road trip that would eventually lead to the Wendorf home in Florida didn't begin as a mission of violence. It began, ironically, as something closer to a rescue fantasy. Heather Wendorf had spoken to Rod about feeling trapped in her life. And that's something many teenagers feel at some point, though most never express it to someone already building a mythology out of shadows and bravado. With Heather's frustrations echoing through his imagination, Rod cast himself as the great liberator. He was not simply a teenage boy anymore. He was the chosen one, the immortal, the figure with a destiny. Heather, intentionally or not, had handed him a narrative climactic enough to sustain his delusions. What he lacked in stability, he made up for in story. The clan packed themselves into a car barely fit for the drive. Charity Kesey, Dana Cooper, Scott Anderson, and Rod. Always Rod, at the center, shaping the tone, shaping the plan, shaping the way they described what they were doing. This wasn't a road trip. It was an exodus. This wasn't a drive through Tennessee and Georgia. It was a pilgrimage. Every mile marker became a signpost. Every gas station became a proving ground. Every hour that passed was another hour in which the fantasy deepened its roots. What's notable about this drive, and there are many things notable about this case, but what's notable about the drive is how ordinary the beginning of it was. They stopped for snacks. They argued about music. They complained about the cramped back seat. They were kids in the simplest and saddest sense of the word, but inside the car there was something happening. The longer they drove, the more Rod's version of the world became the only version. He told them Heather needed rescuing. He told them her parents were abusive, monstrous, cruel. He told them the clan was her only hope. There was no evidence for this, but evidence was irrelevant. The road had become a cocoon, and inside that cocoon, Rod's voice carried more weight than logic ever could. They finally reached Florida after a long, restless drive in which sleep came in brief, disorienting bursts. Exhaustion makes people pliable. It erodes judgment. It makes the improbable suddenly feel inevitable. When they crossed into Eustis, Florida, the group was running on adrenaline, fumes, and Rod's grandiose promises. Rod's plan was simple, at least as he described it. Retrieve Heather, leave the house quietly, and drive away as a group. The clan imagined they would surprise her, whisper through her window, give her the freedom she'd written about in letters and late-night conversations. But Rod's simplicity was always provisional. It existed only until something grander occurred to him. When they arrived at the Wendorf home on the night of November 25th, 1996, Rod instructed the others to wait. The story he would later tell, the one that will follow us into later chapters, is filled with shifting explanations and impossible justifications. What matters for now is that Rod approached that house with a conviction that he alone understood the stakes. He carried a crowbar, not because rescue required it, but because the persona he had crafted required a weapon. Heroes in his stories always carried something theatrical. He entered through the garage. It was dark, it was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. Somewhere inside, Richard and Naoma Wendorf were asleep, unaware that a boy they barely knew had stepped into their home with a story in his head that would end their lives. But that part of the story, the blood, the violence, the irreversible act, that belongs to the next chapter. Tonight, we stay in the hallway of the home, in the last moment before everything changed. Outside, the clan waited in the car, unaware of the transformation unfolding inside the house. They were expecting a return, not a rupture. They thought Rod would emerge with Heather, triumphant and smug, ready to usher them into the next phase of the fantasy. But Rod was already crossing the threshold into something none of them had anticipated. A boy who had only ever pretended to be a predator was about to become one. This is the moment true crime stories always come back to, the hinge, the pivot, the second before the blade meets reality. It's the moment when you want to shout at the characters, turn back, go around, just go home. But stories like this don't listen. They push forward, driven by momentum and delusion, and the intoxicating idea that destiny is waiting just beyond the next door. But before we leave this chapter behind, it's worth remembering the simplest fact. Nothing about this was inevitable. Teenagers who feel misunderstood aren't destined for tragedy. Kids who role-play dark fantasies don't naturally stumble into real-world violence. What made this story dangerous wasn't subculture or eyeliner or even vampire mythology. It was the collision of someone hungry for power and someone willing to give him a stage. The Wendorf home was still quiet. Rod Ferrell was still inside it. And outside, the car was idling, the clan waiting for their leader to come back through that door. They had no idea that the Rod who would emerge was not the Rod who walked in. Stories like this don't break all at once. They crack first, slowly, quietly. And those cracks widen while no one's paying attention. By the time the break finally comes, everyone involved has already crossed a line so subtle, it barely felt like a line at all. That's where we leave Rod and the clan tonight, standing on the invisible edge of something catastrophic. On the next episode of Blood on the Bluegrass, we step inside the Wendorf home. We examine the choices Rod made, the violence that followed, and the aftermath that shattered 2 families and rewired 4 teenagers forever. The fantasy finally collides with reality. And reality is the one that doesn't survive. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod and at Evio Creative. Also, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. And leave a rating and a review. It helps other people to discover the show. Like sharing this episode with someone who loves dark history, true crime, or the psychology of belief turned dangerous. And don't forget to check the show notes for amazing deals from the terrific companies that support our show and still support long-form storytelling. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an Evio production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.